Ava Bennett grabbed the sleeve of my jacket just as I was about to climb onto the second hay wagon. "Not that one," she said, pulling me toward the bench beside her. Before I could ask why, the tractor lurched forward. Somebody behind us yelled that we were leaving 2 people behind, and Ava shifted close enough that her knee pressed against mine. The first fake scarecrow hadn't even appeared yet when she looked at the gap between us and said, "Sit closer." I stared at her. "There is nowhere closer unless you're planning to put me in your lap." Her smile came slow and completely unbothered. "Nathan." I didn't say that was off the table. My name is Nathan Reed, and at 30 I had known Ava long enough to understand when she was teasing me. The problem was that I had never figured out where her teasing stopped. Her older brother Luke had been my best friend since college, which meant Ava had spent years drifting through the edges of my life at cookouts, birthdays, football Sundays, Thanksgiving dinners, and every random Bennett family event Luke had convinced me to attend. She was 27 now, worked as a graphic designer for a museum membership program, and had somehow gone from being Luke's younger sister to being a woman I noticed before I noticed almost anyone else in a room. I had dealt with that development using a highly sophisticated strategy called pretending it wasn't happening. The Bennett family's fall festival weekend normally made that easy because there were always 30 things going on at once. Their hometown in Ohio went hard on October, with pumpkins stacked outside storefronts, cider stands on every corner, bonfires, costume contests, and a haunted hayride that had somehow become mandatory despite Luke complaining about it every single year. That night our group included Luke, 2 cousins, 3 old friends, Ava and me, so I had expected to spend most of the ride making fun of cheap masks while Luke yelled at actors hiding in the corn. Instead, Ava had maneuvered us onto the last bench on the wagon, with everyone else facing forward and the 2 of us tucked near the wooden side rail. If it had been an accident, she was committing very hard to it. The wagon rolled between 2 rows of corn, leaving the festival lights behind until the only illumination came from orange lanterns hanging off the sides. Ava kept one hand looped around my forearm, supposedly because an actor with a chainsaw had jumped from behind a tree 10 seconds earlier. The actor was already gone, but her hand wasn't. "You know the chainsaw doesn't have a chain on it, right?" I asked. "I'm aware. So technically I'm not providing much protection." She glanced at me. "Who said this was about protection?" That answer shut me up longer than I would ever admit to Luke. Another actor dropped from a platform beside us, wearing what looked like a scarecrow mask designed by someone with unresolved childhood issues. Ava startled and leaned fully into my side, laughing as she caught herself. My arm came around her automatically, and for 1 second neither of us moved. I could feel the warmth of her through her sweater, her hand still resting against my sleeve, and the whole noisy wagon seemed to narrow around the small space where our bodies touched. Ava looked up at me with that same amused expression she always wore right before saying something dangerous. "See," she said, "closer was the correct choice." I should have answered with another joke, but all I managed was, "You seem very committed to being right tonight." "I'm committed to several things tonight." She faced forward before I could ask what she meant, which I suspected was intentional. For the rest of the ride, I became painfully aware of every choice she made. When the wagon bounced over a rut, she steadied herself against my thigh instead of the side rail. When the group turned around to laugh at Luke, getting startled by a man dressed as a headless farmer, Ava laughed with them but stayed against me. And when the actors disappeared and the tractor started back toward the festival lights, she still didn't create any distance. That was the moment the scare excuse officially died. I had spent a long time telling myself Ava was simply like this, warm, playful, comfortable with people. It was an appealing theory because it required absolutely nothing from me. If her attention was just Ava being Ava, I could enjoy it without making Luke's sister into a situation that might affect a friendship I valued. But I knew enough about her to recognize the difference between social confidence and deliberate attention. Ava did not accidentally choose the seat beside me, pull me onto it, tell me to sit closer, and then remain pressed against my side after every reason for doing so had disappeared. As the wagon passed under the final string of lights, Ava finally loosened her hand from my arm. I expected her to stand when everyone else did, but she stayed seated while people climbed down ahead of us. "You're very good at pretending not to notice things," she said quietly. I looked at her. "That sounds like an accusation. Maybe it's an observation." "About what?" Ava stood, stepped past me toward the edge of the wagon, and gave me a look that made it obvious she had no intention of helping. "You're the observant one. Figure it out." Luke was waiting near the cider stand when we climbed down, already complaining that the hayride had gotten worse since last year. Ava barely acknowledged him before walking toward the row of food stalls. I assumed she was rejoining one of her cousins until she stopped 20 feet away, turned around, and looked directly at me. She didn't wave, she didn't call my name, she simply waited. Luke was still beside me talking about the fake chainsaw, And for the first time that night there was no dark wagon, no crowded bench, and no haunted attraction giving Ava a reason to choose my company. So when she kept looking at me, the decision sitting between us became embarrassingly clear. I could stay beside Luke and let the hayride become another thing Ava and I would joke about for the next 5 years. Or I could finally admit that maybe the reason I had been so careful around her wasn't because I didn't understand what was happening. Maybe I understood it perfectly. I left Luke mid-sentence and crossed the gravel toward Ava. She watched me come with the smallest hint of satisfaction in her face, like she had expected the decision, but still wanted to see whether I would actually make it. "You abandoned your best friend," she said when I reached her. He was explaining why the chainsaw guy lacked realism. Important work, he'll recover. Ava glanced toward the cider stand, then back at me. "Want one?" I nodded, and we joined the short line together without pretending the hayride had reset anything. Ava ordered hot cider with cinnamon and immediately stole the whipped cream off mine with the wooden spoon from her cup. "You know you could have ordered that," I said. "It tastes better when it's yours." "That sounds like a character flaw. You seemed interested 5 minutes ago." I nearly choked on the cider, which made her grin into her cup. The irritating part was that she wasn't acting especially dramatic about any of it. She was simply carrying the same private energy from the wagon into a completely ordinary public space, as if choosing me beside the food stalls made just as much sense as choosing me in the dark. The rest of the group eventually caught up, and for the next hour the festival became loud again. Luke dragged us through a pumpkin carving display. One of his cousins insisted on a group photo beneath an enormous wooden sign, and somebody bought a bag of kettle corn big enough to feed a small county. When everyone squeezed together for the picture, Ava stepped into the space beside me before anyone else could. Her hand settled lightly against the middle of my back while the photo was taken, then stayed there for another second after everyone started moving. I looked down at her. "You know the camera stopped, did it?" "Very convincing?" "I thought so." That was when I started noticing something uncomfortable about my own behavior. Ava had created the hayride moment. Ava had waited for me afterward. Ava had chosen the spot beside me for the photo. I was responding every time, but responding wasn't the same as choosing. For years I had told myself restraint was proof that I respected Luke and Ava enough not to complicate things casually. Somewhere along the way, that restraint had become extremely convenient, because Ava was taking every risk while I got to enjoy the result. The bonfire started later, out beyond the main festival field where hay bales and folding chairs formed a wide circle around a fire pit. By the time Luke and I arrived with paper trays of food, most of the seats were taken. Ava was sitting between one of her cousins and an empty chair with her jacket folded over the back of it. She saw me looking and lifted the jacket without saying anything. Luke was already heading toward another chair across the fire, so there was no practical reason I needed to sit beside her. I sat there anyway. "Reserved seating?" I asked. Ava took a sip of cider. "Maybe. For anyone specific?" She looked at me over the rim of the cup. "You ask a lot of questions for someone who already sat down." I laughed and stretched my legs toward the fire. For a while we listened to Luke tell an exaggerated story about getting lost at the same festival when he was 12. Ava leaned closer occasionally to add corrections under her breath, and I started noticing that the best part of being beside her wasn't the obvious flirting. It was the private commentary, the small exchange inside the larger conversation, the feeling that the two of us were somehow sharing a second version of the night underneath the public one. 20 minutes later, Ava stood and brushed ash from the knee of her jeans. "I'm walking before I permanently smell like smoke." Nobody paid much attention. She headed toward the darker edge of the festival where the booths thinned out near a line of maple trees, and I watched her go for 3 seconds before realizing I was about to repeat the same pattern again. Waiting for Ava to create the opening, then congratulating myself for accepting it was beginning to feel pathetic. So I stood. Luke glanced over. "Where are you going, walking?" He nodded toward Ava's retreating figure. With her, the question was casual, not suspicious, but it still caught me for half a beat. "If she wants company." Luke shrugged and went back to his story. That simple reaction should have made everything easier. Instead, it made me wonder how much of the complication existed only because I had spent years treating it like something dangerous. I caught up with Ava near a row of closed craft stalls. "Want company?" I asked. She slowed but didn't stop. "Are you offering actual company or conducting another observational study?" "Actual company. Interesting." I fell into step beside her. The festival lights behind us painted the path orange and gold, and fallen leaves scraped across the pavement whenever the wind picked up. Ava kept her hands in her jacket pockets and said, "You know, you're much easier to read than you think. So I've heard recently. You look at me differently when Luke isn't around." That landed exactly where she intended. I shoved my hands into my own pockets. "Do I, Nathan?" "Right, observant." She smiled, but I could tell she wanted an answer more than another joke. I looked ahead for a few steps, then said, "You're not exactly subtle either." Ava turned her head. "About what?" "About me." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's a bold accusation from the man who spent an entire haunted hayride pretending my hand was attached to his arm for safety reasons." I laughed despite myself. "You know what I mean. Maybe I want to hear you say it." There was the difference between us in one sentence. Ava kept making moments visible, while I kept hoping implication would carry enough weight that I never had to own one. I looked at her directly. "You keep choosing me tonight." The teasing left her expression, not completely, but enough. "Yes. And I don't think you're doing it accidentally." "Also yes." We stopped near the edge of the field where the noise from the bonfire had faded into background laughter. Ava watched me for a moment, then asked, "So are you going to keep acting interested only when nobody's watching?" The question wasn't angry. That somehow made it harder. I glanced back toward the glow of the fire, where Luke and the rest of the group were still visible through the trees, then looked at Ava again. Until that second, I had thought the problem was figuring out whether she wanted me to cross the line. Now I understood she had already crossed her half of it. The next part was mine. Ava's question followed me all the way back to the Bennett house. By the time Luke unlocked the front door, I had already thought of 6 answers, rejected all of them, and decided silence was temporarily safer. That decision lasted about 10 minutes. The house filled quickly with jackets, half-eaten caramel apples, people arguing over what movie to put on, and Luke insisting that everyone needed another drink despite nobody asking him to host anything. Ava moved through the room like nothing had changed. She laughed with her cousins, helped her mother carry bowls into the kitchen, and sat on the arm of the couch while Luke complained about the haunted hayride again. The only person behaving differently was me. I caught myself doing exactly what Ava had accused me of. When Luke was across the room, I looked at her too long. When he came back, I found something else to focus on. When Ava handed me a bottle of water, I said thanks like we had spent the entire evening discussing weather instead of her hand being wrapped around my arm in the dark. She noticed. Of course she noticed. At one point, she passed behind my chair and murmured, "Impressive recovery," quietly enough that only I could hear. "From what?" I asked. "Apparently nothing." Then she kept walking. That bothered me because she wasn't wrong. I had spent years telling myself I was being careful because Luke mattered to me, and that explanation had always sounded respectable enough to end the argument. Luke and I had been friends for almost a decade. We had lived together in college, survived terrible roommates, worse jobs, 2 disastrous camping trips, and enough bad decisions to know exactly which stories were never allowed near our mothers. I trusted him. I respected his family. Somewhere along the way, I had decided that wanting Ava meant risking all of that. So I had solved the problem by never asking whether the risk was actually real. Around midnight, people started disappearing upstairs or heading home. Luke fell asleep halfway through the movie with one foot still on the coffee table, which was impressive considering he had spent the previous hour claiming he was wide awake. I helped carry empty cups into the kitchen and found Ava there alone, stacking leftover cider bottles beside the refrigerator. She glanced at me, then returned to what she was doing. "Need help?" I asked. "I think I can defeat 3 bottles without assistance." "Good to know." I picked up a bag of chips anyway and folded the top closed. For a minute, the only sound was the refrigerator humming and somebody laughing faintly upstairs. Ava set the last bottle down and leaned against the counter. "You've been weird since we got back." "I'm always weird. Different category." She studied me, then added, "You spent half the evening acting like we barely know each other." I looked toward the doorway even though Luke was asleep 2 rooms away. Ava caught that too. "See? That." I leaned against the opposite counter. "Luke is my best friend. I'm aware. I've met him. You know what I mean?" Ava crossed her arms. "Actually, I don't think I do anymore." There was no teasing in her voice now, which made it harder to hide behind mine. "What exactly do you think would be wrong about wanting me?" The directness of it almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because Ava had apparently decided subtlety had failed and moved on to demolition. I rubbed a hand across the back of my neck. "It's not that wanting you is wrong." Her eyebrows lifted. Strong opening. "Let me finish." She gestured for me to continue. "Luke matters to me. Your family matters to me. I don't want to turn something that's been good for years into some secret situation where I'm sneaking around with his sister and hoping nobody notices." Ava was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Nathan, I'm 27. I know. Luke doesn't approve my dating applications. I know that too. Then stop talking like this is a custody arrangement." I let out a breath. "That's not what I'm doing." "It kind of is." She pushed away from the counter and came closer, but not flirtatiously this time. "If you don't want me, say that. I can handle it. If you do want me, but you've decided Luke's friendship matters more, say that too. What I don't want is you acting like you're protecting me from a decision I'm perfectly capable of making." That one landed cleanly. I had no clever answer because the truth was less flattering than the version I had been using. I'm not worried you can't decide, I said. I'm worried about what happens after we decide. Ava's expression shifted slightly. Meaning? Meaning if we start something and it goes badly, Luke is still my best friend. You're still his sister. Thanksgiving still exists. Birthdays still exist. I don't get to disappear from one part of my life without affecting the other. I looked down at the folded chip bag in my hands and added, that makes it harder to treat this casually. Ava stared at me for a moment, then nodded once. Okay, that I understand. The fact that she didn't immediately argue made me look up. I don't want casual either, she said. But you've been acting like the only options are doing nothing or blowing up the Bennett family Christmas card. I have not. You absolutely have. The corner of her mouth twitched, then faded again. I'm willing to risk awkwardness if this matters. What I'm not willing to do is keep being the person who makes every move while you stand there, deciding whether responding technically counts as participation. There it was. Not anger, not an ultimatum, just a fact I had already started realizing at the festival. Ava had pulled me onto the hayride. Ava had told me to sit closer. Ava had waited for me afterward. Ava had saved the chair. Even when I followed her for the walk, she had still been the one forcing the real questions into the open. I had been calling myself careful while letting her do all the dangerous work. I don't want you carrying all of it, I said. Ava held my eyes. Good. For 1 second I thought she might step closer or smile or give me another opening. She didn't. Instead, she picked up the cider bottles and put them into the refrigerator. Then don't. The next morning that sentence felt louder than anything she had said on the hayride. The Bennett kitchen was full of coffee, pancakes, and people talking over one another about the day's festival plans. Ava sat at the table beside one of her cousins instead of saving me a chair. When everyone started arguing about whether to visit the pumpkin trail before lunch, she didn't look across the room to see what I wanted to do. She wasn't cold, she wasn't punishing me. She was simply no longer creating the path and waiting to see whether I would walk down it. For the first time all weekend, I understood exactly what losing her attention felt like before I had ever properly had it. More importantly, I understood that Ava had already answered the question I had spent years avoiding. She was willing to risk something. If I wanted this to move another inch, the next risk belonged to me. By 10 that morning, I had spent enough time watching Ava not choose me to understand how much I had gotten used to it. She wasn't ignoring me. That would have been easier to label. She laughed when I said something stupid over breakfast, passed me the syrup when I asked, and even corrected Luke when he claimed I had slept through an entire college final because I had actually been awake and failing responsibly. But she didn't save me a seat, didn't catch my eye when plans changed, and didn't create one of those little private openings she had been building all weekend. She had said the next risk belonged to me, and apparently she meant it. The festival was already crowded when we arrived. Families moved between pumpkin displays, food tents, craft booths, and the trail that wound through the wooded edge of the grounds. Luke gathered everyone near a map and started assigning destinations with the confidence of a man who had never successfully organized more than 3 people in his life. Pumpkin trail first, then lunch, then whoever wants to do the cider tasting can do that, he said. One of his cousins immediately objected. Another wanted to see the costume contest. Ava stood a few feet away talking to a friend she had run into. Smiling at something the woman said, I could have waited. Someone would eventually split the group, and there would almost certainly be a moment when Ava and I ended up near each other again. That had been my method for years. Let circumstances make the decision, then call my response natural. Instead, before I had enough time to rethink it, I walked across the space between us. Ava, she turned. Yeah? Walk the pumpkin trail with me before everyone meets for food. Her friend's eyebrows went up. Ava's didn't. She just looked at me for a second longer than necessary. Just us? That was the idea. Luke was close enough to hear. I knew because he stopped arguing with his cousin and glanced over, but I didn't look toward him. Ava did briefly, then returned her attention to me. Okay, she said. Give me 2 minutes. There was no dramatic reaction from anyone. Luke went back to the map. Ava finished her conversation. I stood there feeling slightly ridiculous for how significant such a simple invitation had seemed in my head. Maybe that was part of the problem. I had treated asking Ava to spend time alone with me like it required a legal review, when in reality all I had done was say what I wanted where other people could hear it. The pumpkin trail started behind the main field and wound through tall trees strung with orange lights and carved lanterns. Ava walked beside me with her hands tucked into her jacket pockets, but she didn't immediately tease me about the invitation. After 5 minutes, the silence became suspicious. You're very quiet, I said. Am I required to entertain you? Historically, you've considered it a public service. She smiled. I'm giving you space. That sounds dangerous. You asked me to come with you. I figured I'd let you explain why. I looked at her. Because I wanted to be with you. Ava kept walking. That's better. Better than what? Then I thought you might like the trail, or Luke wanted us to split up. or some other sentence where nobody technically chooses anything. I laughed quietly. You really were prepared for me to ruin this. I've known you a long time. We passed a row of pumpkins carved with faces that ranged from impressive to deeply unfortunate. A little boy ran by holding his father's hand, nearly colliding with a hay bale before being redirected. Ava watched him go, then said, I wasn't trying to punish you this morning. I know. I just needed to stop making it easy for you to stay halfway in. I nodded. Also no. She glanced at me. And? I exhaled, and I didn't like it. Her smile appeared instantly. My absence was devastating. Let's not get reckless. Emotionally destabilizing, mildly inconvenient. Nathan, I laughed. Fine, I noticed. A lot. Her expression softened. Good. That one word carried more warmth than the entire conversation in the kitchen the night before. We walked another stretch before I said, I kept telling myself I was being respectful. Ava looked ahead. You were, at first, and then I started wondering whether you respected me enough to believe I knew what I was doing. I let that settle. Fair. She kicked a leaf off the edge of the path. I don't want to be somebody you sneak around with because you're afraid Luke will have an opinion. I don't want that either. She finally looked at me. Then what do you want? There were people 30 yards ahead and another couple behind us, so it wasn't exactly private. That helped, strangely. There was no charged darkness, no haunted wagon, no midnight kitchen. Just a normal trail in broad daylight and a question I couldn't blame on atmosphere. I want to take you out after this weekend, I said. Somewhere that has nothing to do with your family, Luke, pumpkins, or anyone wearing fake blood. Ava's mouth curved. Very specific exclusions. I'm setting standards. And is this a date? Yes, she stopped walking. I stopped too. For once I didn't feel the need to add a joke immediately after the answer. Ava studied my face, then said, that was almost alarmingly clear. I can make it worse if you want. Please don't. We started walking again, closer now. Our hands brushed once, then again, and this time I took hers without waiting for her to turn it into a challenge. Ava looked down at our joined hands and smiled. Look at you. Don't make this unbearable. I'm proud. That's worse. She laughed and squeezed my fingers. Near the far end of the trail, the trees opened onto a small overlook above the festival grounds. From there we could see the Ferris wheel turning slowly behind the tents, the bonfire area from the night before, and the hayride wagons moving along the far field. Ava leaned against the wooden railing. Do you still think this is going to blow up your friendship with Luke? No, I stood beside her. I think I was using the possibility because it was easier than admitting I didn't know what would happen if you and I actually tried this. And now? Now I'd rather find out. Ava turned toward me fully. That sounds more like you. What does? Choosing once you finally decide something matters. I smiled. You make me sound extremely slow. I have evidence. I moved closer, and this time there was no question about who was creating the moment. Ava's expression changed as soon as she realized what I was doing. She didn't step back. I lifted one hand to her cheek and kissed her. It was softer than the hayride had been charged, quieter than the kitchen had been difficult, but it felt more consequential because nothing had pushed us there except choice. Ava's fingers curled into the front of my jacket, and when we pulled apart, she stayed close enough that her forehead almost touched mine. Took you long enough, she said. I knew you were going to say that. You earned it. I smiled and kissed her again, shorter this time. When we finally headed back toward the main field, Ava kept her hand in mine for the first half of the walk, then let go only when the path narrowed around another family. Nothing about the gesture felt secretive. It felt practical, which was somehow more intimate. Luke was standing near the food tents when we returned, holding 2 paper baskets and looking annoyed about something involving barbecue sauce. He glanced from me to Ava, then at the trail behind us. Where did you two disappear to? He asked casually. Ava looked at me, not because she needed me to answer for her, but because she wanted to see whether I would retreat now that the choice had an audience. For the first time all weekend, I already knew exactly what I was going to say. I asked Ava to walk the pumpkin trail with me, I said. Luke looked at me, then at his sister, then back at me with the expression of a man trying to decide whether he had missed something obvious. Just you two? He asked. Yeah. Ava stood beside me, calm enough that I suddenly appreciated how little interest she had in turning the moment into a spectacle. Luke handed one of the barbecue baskets to his cousin, freeing a hand to rub the back of his neck. Okay, is this a new thing? Or have I somehow been asleep for 6 months? Ava laughed, mostly new. Your observational skills remain questionable. Luke ignored that and looked at me again. I could have softened it, made it sound casual, or suggested we were simply figuring things out. Instead I said, I like her. I asked her on a date after this weekend. Luke's eyebrows went up, but before he could respond, Ava stepped in. And before you start interviewing him, I'm here too. Luke stared at her. I wasn't going to interview him. You have an interview face. I have one face. Unfortunately, that broke some of the tension, but Luke still looked unsettled in the normal way people do when 2 familiar pieces of their life suddenly connect differently. I'm not mad, he said finally. It's just weird. For you, Ava said. I'm doing great. I tried not to laugh and failed. Luke pointed at me. You're enjoying this too much. I'm actually having a terrible time. Good. His expression sobered slightly. Look, I trust you, obviously. But if this gets messy, I'm going to be stuck in the middle. That was fair, and it was exactly the consequence I had been using to justify doing nothing. I know, I said. And I don't want that either. I'm not asking you to approve anything. I'm telling you because I respect you enough not to pretend nothing's happening. Luke looked at Ava, who gave him a small shrug. Same, she said. You don't have to love the idea today. You just don't get a vote. Luke stared at her for 2 seconds, then snorted. There she is. Ava smiled. Missed me? Not remotely. He looked back at me and shook his head slowly. This is going to take some adjustment. That's allowed, I said. Good. Because right now I'm remembering every stupid thing you've ever done. That seems unfairly broad. I have material. Ava reached for my sleeve and pulled me slightly away from him. Ignore him. He processes affection through threats. Luke called after us. I heard that, but he was already smiling. And the knot I had been carrying around for years loosened enough that I almost felt ridiculous for how large I had allowed it to become. Ava and I wandered toward the far side of the festival while Luke rejoined the others. For a while, neither of us said much. The afternoon crowd had gotten thicker, and the air smelled like wood smoke, fried dough, and cinnamon. Ava eventually glanced at me. That mattered. Luke not punching me. I was never worried about that. She slid her hands into her jacket pockets. You answering him without pretending we were just taking a friendly walk mattered. I looked at her. More than the kiss. Different category. I was hoping the kiss scored well. Strong technical performance. Thank you. She smiled, but then her expression softened. I needed to know I wasn't going to be the brave one every time this got inconvenient. That hit exactly where it was supposed to. I had thought courage meant making one big move once I was certain. Ava had understood something I hadn't, that if a relationship mattered, there would probably be dozens of smaller moments when one person had to risk looking more invested than the other. She had already done that on the hayride, at the bonfire, and in the kitchen. It was my turn to make sure she didn't have to keep pulling me toward her. You won't be, I said. Ava watched my face for a second, then nodded like she believed me. We found a quiet table behind the cider tent, and finally talked about what came after the weekend. Not in the dramatic way I had imagined conversations like that were supposed to happen. There was no speech about destiny or years of hidden longing. I asked if she was free Thursday. She said she was, unless a museum donor suddenly developed an emergency involving brochure fonts. I suggested dinner at a little Italian place halfway between my apartment and hers. Ava asked, Are you officially asking me on a date? Yes. Again? I'm trying to establish consistency. She leaned closer. I accept your ongoing improvement program. The rest of the afternoon felt easier, not less charged, but less confusing. Ava still teased me. Except now I started giving it back without pretending every flirtatious line had plausible deniability. When she stole one of my fries at lunch, I took her cider in retaliation and made her negotiate for it. When everyone stopped for another group photo, I put my arm around her before she had a chance to arrange us. She looked up at me and whispered, Show off. Documented evidence. Her grin was worth whatever expression Luke was probably making behind the camera. That evening, after most of the group had started drifting toward the parking area, Ava and I passed the haunted hayride entrance again. The line was shorter than the night before, and one of the wagons was loading beneath strings of orange lights. Ava slowed and looked at it, then at me. Think you could handle another ride? Probably. Because if we go again, I might have to tell you to sit closer. She barely got the last word out before I hooked an arm around her waist and pulled her against my side. Ava laughed, catching herself against my chest. Wow. Aggressive improvement. I'm tired of waiting for instructions. Dangerous development. We didn't actually get back on the hayride. We stood there for a minute watching another wagon disappear into the dark, and I realized I didn't need to recreate the night before for it to matter. Ava had pulled me toward her because she was done pretending there was nothing between us. What changed everything wasn't that I finally sat closer. It was that afterward, I stopped making her be the only person willing to close the distance. I used to think restraint was automatically a good thing. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it gives people room and keeps you from making choices you haven't earned yet. But with Ava, I had let restraint become a comfortable excuse for never risking an answer. She didn't need me to become reckless. She just needed me to meet her halfway once she made it clear she was already there.
Looking back over Nathan and Ava's weekend, the haunted hayride only exposed a pattern that had already existed for years. Ava had become more than Luke's younger sister in Nathan's mind, but he kept treating that old label like a rule because it allowed him to enjoy the attraction without having to make a decision. On the wagon, Ava made her interest almost impossible to miss. She pulled him beside her, told him to sit closer, stayed against him after the scares were over, then waited for him afterward instead of returning automatically to the group. Nathan followed her, but Ava was still the one creating nearly every opening. That imbalance became the real conflict. Ava saved him a chair at the bonfire, pulled him into private moments, and eventually confronted him in the Bennett kitchen about acting interested only when Luke was not looking. Nathan finally explained the part that was actually true. He was not afraid that Ava could not make her own choices. He was afraid that if a relationship went badly, his friendship with Luke and his place in the Bennett family would still exist afterward. Ava understood that concern, but she also made clear that she was not willing to keep taking every emotional risk, while Nathan called his passivity respect. The next morning, Ava changed nothing except her effort. She was friendly, warm, and completely herself, but she stopped saving seats, creating private moments, and arranging opportunities for Nathan to choose her. That absence did more than another flirtatious line could have done. Nathan finally recognized how much he had depended on Ava to make the relationship easy for him. So at the festival, in broad daylight and within earshot of other people, he asked her to walk the pumpkin trail with him alone. There he said what he wanted plainly. He wanted to take her on a real date after the family weekend ended. Nathan's next choices mattered because they stayed consistent once the situation became public. He took Ava's hand, kissed her because he initiated the moment, and when Luke asked where they had been, Nathan did not retreat into a harmless explanation. He said he liked Ava and had asked her out. Luke needed time to adjust, but he did not become the disaster Nathan had imagined. More importantly, Ava saw that she would not have to be brave for both of them every time the relationship became inconvenient. By the end, they did not need to recreate the hayride or hide inside teasing. The important change was that Nathan had finally learned to close some of the distance himself. What makes this story work is the distinction between restraint and avoidance. Nathan's original instinct had a reasonable foundation. Dating his best friend's sister could affect more than two people if it ended badly, and pretending otherwise would have been careless. The problem was that he kept using that legitimate concern after Ava had already shown she understood the stakes and still wanted a choice of her own. Ava's most revealing move was not telling Nathan to sit closer. It was what she did the next morning when she stopped creating opportunities for him. She did not become cold or manipulative. She simply removed the extra effort she had been supplying. That exposed how one-sided the risk had become. Nathan had been benefiting from her courage while telling himself that his own hesitation was protecting everyone. The public moments matter for the same reason. Asking Ava to walk the trail while Luke could hear, taking her hand outside the privacy of the hayride, and then telling Luke directly that he liked her were not performances. They were consistency. Nathan finally behaved the same way when the relationship was visible as he did when he and Ava were alone. And Ava's line about not wanting to be the brave one every time gets to the heart of the story. Mutual attraction is not enough if one person always has to create the opening, absorb the uncertainty, and force every honest conversation. What changed between them was not that caution disappeared. Responsibility became shared. Ava made the first move more than once. But the story only really changed when she stopped doing all the work. If you were in Nathan's position, what would have finally pushed you to act? The hayride, the kitchen conversation, or realizing she had stopped choosing for both of you? I want to hear where you think the turning point was. If you enjoyed the tension in this one, a like and subscribe helps bring more stories like it your way.